Hello and welcome to our beginning look of the integumentary system. This is going to be a little different of a format. There's only two videos that we're going to be looking at with the integumentary system. And the rest of the content is actually built out in its own separate module. And so I've kind of outlined some notes and some highlights for you to understand with the integumentary system. So these two videos here are going to be really focused on some very specific aspects of the integumentary system. The first aspect that we're going to look at actually in this video is kind of an in-depth look at um, skin tone and where do we get these varying degrees of skin tone at, and how does this relate to or how does this tie into um, issues of racism and systemic racism, and where did this idea of systemic racism really initiate from and come from? So we're going to look at the history of what causes skin tone from an evolutionary perspective, and then we're going to kind of turn that tide and really look at how science has been kind of guilty of perpetrating this idea of a superior race, and even just the notion that race exists. Um, and this is something that's going to, as we go through and we do this discussion, um, this is something that is not new. This is not something that has been around since the 50s or the 20s or the 1910s. This actually goes back to the 1700s, um, and this idea of a superior race. And so we're gonna kind of spend some time really looking uh, at this and what are the biological implications of this? What does biology really have to say about that? And so to start this, we are going to be looking here at the overview of skin, and there shouldn't be anything here that is overly earth-shattering to you. Much of this is what we've already looked at in the lab setting. All right, so we see right down here we have our stratum basal right here. All right, and then remember this is a single layer of cells, and these cells that are here are mitotically active. Now, there's a couple other types of cells that we're going to kind of touch on here in a few minutes, but this bottom layer here, of course, is the stratum basal. And then, of course, we have that second layer here, which is the stratum spinosum. These cells are all mitotically active. These cells are all alive and well. And then we enter into the granulosum, the stratum granulosum, where these cells take on high amounts of a protein called keratin, and these cells start to die off. And by the time they reach the stratum corneum, this outer layer here, of course, those cells have all keratinized and died. Um, and again, this is something that is an overview really from the lab. What I want to focus on in our time together for this video is what are the unique cells that are happening down here in the stratum basal, and what are the implications of what's going on here? All right, what are the implications here? So the first cell that we have here, this is a tactile cell, and tactile cells kind of are pressure point cells, and so they aid in sensory. They aid in exactly how much pressure in order to pick something up. We don't really care about them too much in the context of where we're going with this lesson. The other cell type that is here in the stratum spinosum is a dendritic cell, and those dendritic cells really function more as an immune cell. And so they work with the immune system to go ahead and uh, carry out the function of being a barrier to potential pathogens, bacteria, viruses, whatever it might be, that's on the outside and preventing them from getting into the body. And so that's these dendritic cells right here. But then we've got this guy right down here. Right? This is a melanocyte. Now, melanocytes are the cell type that is responsible for the production of melanin. And melanin is the chemical that is produced within the body that gives us skin tone. Right? So, what determines whether or not you are fairer skinned or darker skinned, whether you are black or brown, really comes down to the type and the amount of melanin that are being produced from these melanocytes that are within the stratum basale. Now, I should mention that everybody has approximately the same number of melanocytes within them as an adult. What varies, once again, is the amount of melanin produced and the types of melanin that are produced. Everybody produces or has the ability to produce both types of melanin. And I'll give you some examples of this as we go through and we look at this. So I want to focus in right here on this guy. This is another melanocyte right here. All right. And what ends up happening is melanocytes produce the melanin within the actual cell, and they insert these granules of melanin into vesicles that are called melanosomes. And so the melanocytes produce melanin and stores the melanin in structures that we refer to as melanosomes. In structures called melanosomes. Now, these melanosomes travel up. They travel up these arms, these dendritic tips of the melanocytes. Right? And so these here, these little extensions that you see coming out off of the melanocyte, these are dendritic extensions. And these melanosomes travel down these dendritic arms of the melanocytes. You can see some in there, and they get released into the stratum spinosum. And it's within the stratum spinosum. It's within the stratum spinosum where these melanosomes cluster around the nuclei. And so here's the nuclei of that squamous cell. Here's the nuclei, here's the nuclei. These melanosomes cluster around the top of the nuclei, and they form what we refer to as supernuclear caps. They create something that's referred to as supernuclear caps. Right, around the nuclei. Now, what's the importance of these supernuclear caps? Well, melanin is designed to protect the layers of the epidermis from UV radiation. So there's three types of UV radiation. There's UVA, UVB, UVC. UVC pretty much hits the outer atmospheres of the Earth, and it gets reflected back out into space. UVA can pass through the Earth's atmosphere, kind of gets bounced around a little bit and then heads back out. But it's UVB that we are most concerned about. UVB can actually be absorbed by the cells into the nucleus of the simple squamous cells, or of the stratified squamous cells in the skin, and this is what causes damage. This is what triggers potentially the development of skin cancer. All right. Well, these supernuclear caps, these structures that have large amounts of melanin in them, arrange themselves around the top part of the nucleus to protect the nucleus from that UVB. The darker the melanin, the more protected the nuclei become. And there's reasons for that we will get into. Right? We're not there yet, but I promise you we will get into it. One of the things that we know, looking at evolution, is that melanin is thought to have evolved about 12 million years ago in primates. Now you're going to watch a video called the biology of skin, and you're going to get a little bit more of an understanding of this. But about 12 million years ago, we believe melanin evolved within primates. Now, at that point in time, the primary type of melanin that was in existence, and again, we're going to go into this a little bit more, was what we called Hold on one second. Pheomelanin. And pheomelanin is a type of melanin that produces more of your red, yellow, orange, pale type of skin tones. Right? So pheomelanin was the primary melanin that is thought to have evolved about 12 million years ago in primates. This is not the first time, evolutionarily speaking, that we've seen something that gives skin pigment. You've got photoreceptors in things like octopus that are color changing. They are photochromatic cells. All right. And so this idea of melanin was not really new. We've seen earlier versions, quote unquote, earlier versions of melanin in other animals. All right. But this is the first time that we are believed to have seen this develop within our own evolutionary lineages. Keep in mind, as humans, as Homo sapiens, we are classified as a primate, right, from an evolutionary perspective. Now, melanin evolves about 12 million years ago, and then we come across this guy here, Salahanthropus Chadensis. Now, Salahanthropus Chadensis is thought to be the common ancestor. And so if we come down here, right, and we look at a common ancestor, that would have led to the evolution of humans and led to the evolution of the other great apes. Right? Humans are considered one of the great apes, but the other great apes, in other words, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, right? They're the other great apes. So this common ancestor, Salahanthropus chadensis, led to the divergence and the splitting up of our earliest hominid ancestors in one branch, and the apes, the other great apes, in another branch. This is one of the reasons why, and this is a very mistaught, misconception in a lot of high school science classes, and I've even seen it done in college classes as well, where there's this idea that humans evolved from chimps. We did not. Right? Looking at the evolutionary lineage, and we're going to look at this a little bit more, but looking at this evolutionary lineage, We did not evolve from chimps. We evolved from a common ancestor. And we went one way, and the chimps went the other way. Um, and this happened about 6 to 7 million years ago. Right? So 6 to 7 million years ago, this split from Salahanthropus Chadensis occurred, where again the great apes stayed more arboreal. They stayed within the forested areas, and then you've got these very early hominids, Australopithecines. All right, that left the arboreal life. They left the forested, wooded life, and they started going out into more of the open savannas, the lower plains. They started to go ahead and try to thrive along the coastal waterways. Now, follow me here, all right? Because here's your evolutionary tree. All right? Here is Salahanthropus chadensis right down here. All right. You can see moving up this way here, you have very early hominids. All right. Your chimps would have been branched off over here. All right. So your genus Pan or chimps would have evolved their own separate way going off this way. And here now you've got your hominid evolution. Right? So you've got your again your Ardipithecus. Right? You have your Australopithecines over here. You have your robust Australopithecines over here. They're called robust because their facial features, their bone density was much greater than their earlier predecessors, the Australopithecines. Um, Australopithecines, just to kind of put it in perspective, if you've ever heard of Lucy, about 4 million years ago, the first hominid at that point in time, the first hominid fossilized remains found in Africa. Right? She was an Australopithecines. Right? She was a Australopithecus afarensis. Right? That's what Lucy was, and she would be right here. Right? This is what her common ancestor would have looked like over here. All right. Well, we don't really care about these guys all too much. We want to kind of come over to this area right over here. All right. So what we believe started to happen was as we moved out of the covered protection and shade of the forest, and we started to go out into these open lands a little bit more, we started to become more and more upright. And as we did that, we lost a lot of our hair. Well, underneath of all of that hair was this pigmented skin that tended to be more light, pheomelanin. Right? Well, deep in the regressions here, right, these earliest hominids, right, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, um, Homo heidelbergensis, right, florensis over here, Homo neanderthalensis over here, right, the Denisovans over here, and then eventually leading into the Homo sapiens. These guys had a mutation within their gene that codes for skin pigment. And what we started to see here is a greater increase in what we call the Mcr1 gene. Right? This stands for melanocortin receptor 1 gene. All right. And this Mcr1 gene was a was an allele of the skin pigment gene that specifically codes for a type of melanin called eumelanin. And eumelanin codes for black and brown pigment. Now, that black and brown pigment gave advantage to these very early hominids that were kind of all living together. If you look at this time frame, we had multiple human or hominid species coexisting all at the same time. Homo habilis lived with Homo erectus. Homo erectus actually kind of overlapped in with Homo neanderthalensis, and we think he was even around when Homo sapiens, our own selves, were around. And then you had this very isolated group of Denisov, try that again, Denisovans that actually are thought to have been related to the very early Aboriginal people of Australia, right? Not to mention also linked with some of the Tibetan areas over in China and Asia. In fact, we see a lot of overlap with that. And I mention this because it's funny that all of these species were all coexisting, and there may have actually been interbreeding between them. Why is that important? Well, that is important to understand because of something we'll get into here in a few minutes, because it actually does tie into what we refer to as something called race science. This belief that one race, and race doesn't really exist biologically, and I'll explain why, but one race is superior to all of the other ones. And that there are biological factors that have isolated out these quote unquote races, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's still a belief that Africans, that black individuals have a lower IQ and a lower mental acuity and can't achieve to the same level of intellect as the white race. There are researchers out there that still believe this. And a lot of this dates back to, again, the very early 1800s going into the latter part of the 1700s. And I'll get into some more of that here in a few minutes. But what we know here is that the human species started its evolutionary journey here in Central Africa. And from Africa, actually, populations migrated their way out of Africa, up into Europe, over into Asia, down into Australia, up into what is now Russia, and over into North America, down into South America. Now, keep in mind that 1,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, a lot of these land masses were connected by land bridges. And so transportation and being able to move, not transportation as in walking, from one continent to the other was very easy. And they didn't realize they were doing that. But we believe that as early hominid populations started to migrate their way out of Africa and spread and inhabit other parts of the world, that you had different frequencies in these alleles between these populations, these what we refer to as a bottleneck population. And so you get one group of a population that gets stranded or gets isolated in one area, and they start to breed with one another. And as they breed with one another, they start to develop and they start to have allele frequencies that are unique to them. It's not a different species, and it's not a race. Right? Genetically, these are all Homo sapiens. These are all humans, despite the fact that they are geographically isolated. And that's one of the key things here. This is, by the way, this is what we refer to as the out of Africa theory, that we all evolved from a common ancestor or common ancestors in Africa. And those very early common ancestors all migrated their way out of Africa to populate the rest of the world. Now, that is opposed by something that's called the multi-regional theory. And the multi-regional theory said, yep, nope, Africans evolved in Africa and Australians evolved it over in Australia, and the Eurasians, they evolved over here is totally separate, and the North Americans, they evolved completely isolated and separate and independent from all of the other populations all over in the other world. And what we know is genetically that doesn't add up. Genetically, all humans are 97% identical. And that is not enough of a variation to be considered to have different races biologically. Chimps have different races. You've got your highland chimps, you've got your lowland chimps, and you've got your bonobos. They're all chimps, but there's a great enough degree of difference, genetic difference between those populations that they are truly races compared to the entire species. And what we know within humans is that there is more genetic diversity within isolated groups than what there is amongst the entire species. So there's highly conserved genes in all of us that link us back into a common ancestor in Africa, hence the term out of Africa theory. There's more highly conserved genes in all of those than if you just look at the genes that are unique to certain areas, let's say North Americans or Europeans or Asians or Africans or South Americans. You have more genetic diversity within those smaller subgroups than what you do across the entire species. And that points to the fact that we are all one species. And not only are we all one species, but we're all one species that originated out of this common area known as Africa. And that we all had this one variant of a gene, the Mcr1 gene, that basically allows for darker skin pigment. And the reason for that darker skin pigment, as you'll see here on this diagram, uh, the variation in skin pigments directly align with the areas of the world that have the highest amounts of UV radiation compared to the lowest amounts of UV radiation. So as you move further from the equator, skin tones tend to get lighter, as does the intensity of the UV radiation. UV radiation is highest along the equator as well as within the mountainous region. So the higher in elevation you are, the more exposure to UV radiation you're going to get. And that this is one of the driving forces of skin tone as a mechanism to go ahead and preserve life by protecting the stratified squamous cells from developing cancer. That doesn't explain it all, right? Because evolution tries to preserve the ability to reproduce. And most people, by the time you develop skin cancer, you would have already reproduced. And so that doesn't explain at all why we have the melanin. And I'm going to let you watch the video to go ahead and kind of pull out some of those other regions. I will tell you, vitamin D production is also tied to varying amounts of melanin, whether it's a combination of eumelanin and or pheomelanin. And that is impacted by where you are located from the amount of UV radiation that you have. And folate, which is a very important mineral, especially in the health of sperm and pregnancy and fetal development within the mother. Folate is directly tied to the amount of UV radiation that you are exposed to, which we all need some, which can be altered by the type of melanin that you have. And so we start to see a lot of overlays here. We start to see a lot of links here and how this is connected. and that it's actually advantageous, depending on the part of the world that you live in, to be able to produce higher amounts of eumelanin, the darker pigments, as opposed to pheomelanin, which are the lighter, fairer pigments. But it can also be a detriment. Because if you're living in Chicago and you are a highly pigmented person, darkly pigmented person, you're going to have issues synthesizing vitamin D. You're going to have issues synthesizing folate, which is very often why it's a supplement for during pregnancy, because that does directly tie into the overall health of the developing fetus. And so I'm going to let you kind of look around the video that's linked into this week's module. To try to get a better understanding of that. All right. Uh, the other thing that I will say is when we talk about cancer, one of the things that UVB does directly that links to cancer is it produces something that's referred to as dipyrimidine photo products. Right? In other words, through the use of light, we create these dipyrimidines. And remember, pyrimidines are not supposed to be able to link together. Adenine always binds with thymine. Guanine always binds with cytosine. Well, when you are overexposed to UV radiation, and let's say you do not produce enough eumelanin, you're producing more pheomelanin, then what can happen is you can actually take the hydrogen bonds that are linking together nucleotides, and you can create bonds between cytosine and cytosine, or you can create bonds between cytosine and thymine, or you can create bonds between thymine and thymine. And this leads to mutations within the stratified squamous, specifically within the stratum spinosum, that can eventually lead to skin cancer. And so there is that concern that is here, although again, that's not the primary reason why we see these differences in melanin. So melanin is very much all about biological advantage. All right. And this idea of race is actually not rooted in science, even though for centuries we've tried to make it about that. It is a social construct. And it's a social construct that started in the late 1700s during the Enlightenment period has just ended. Right? The Enlightenment period has just ended. And the Europeans are starting to go ahead and kind of take over the leader of the world role. And in doing so, they're traveling and discovering other lands. And they're running into these individuals, they're running into these inhabitants that don't look like them. And they're looking at how they're living and they're like, my God, these people are primitive. These people are not on the same level as us. Their tools, their technology, their hunting, their homes, their architecture are so inferior to what we have over in Europe. Us Europeans are far more advanced than these people that we're meeting on these other places that we're traveling to. And they look different than us. They've got different skin tones than us. This skin tone must be an evolutionary artifact that shows just how inferior they are. And us, as the white Europeans, are the superior race. And we can back that up with science. Look at the black Aboriginal Australians. They're using simple tools. They must be very much like the Neanderthals, or as the proper pronunciation is the Neanderthals, right? Homo neanderthalensis, the original caveman. Homo neanderthalensis was looked upon as being this lumbering idiot. In fact, when Homo neanderthalensis was first discovered in 1856, right, by a world-renowned biologist by the name of Ernest Haeckel, jot this down. The year is 1856. The biologist, the German biologist at that, is Ernest Haeckel. And he's actually, there's an embryology picture that kind of a diagram that shows different stages of development for like a fish and a salamander and a bird and a human and like a chicken. He's the same guy that developed that, and there's issues with that as well. But Ernest Haeckel, upon discovering Homo neanderthalensis, wanted to name him Homo stupidus, right? And that's a true story. Right? Because they looked very, very primitive. They looked very not like the white European that was thought of to be the superior race. And the earliest travelers over to places like Australia, those earliest travelers looked at these Aboriginal people and their primitive lifestyle, and they looked at their facial features and they're like, oh my God, these people are inferior to us, and on the ladder of evolution of humans, they're near the bottom of the rung, right above Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. These people are cavemen. We can control them. The whole basis of race science emerged in the context of a European colonial political ideologies of oppression and exploitation, in the hopes to be able to lift up the white colonial European to maintain control over everybody else. If we grouped people based on on what we perceived as being inferior characteristics, it made the earliest colonial Europeans, it made it easier for them to control and overthrow and gain more land. And when we revolted against Europe, when we revolted against the Queen and we broke off and we came over here to the Americas, we brought that exact same ideology over here with us. The country was founded on white superiority, based off of bad manipulated science to uplift the white European man to be dominant over everybody else. The fallacy of white superiority, white supremacy, was rooted in biology. The earliest biologists, including Darwin, were classical racists. For the purpose of uplifting white intellect. We're going to touch more on this. 1758. Where did Ernest Haeckel get this idea that Aboriginal Australians were one step away from, or I shouldn't say it wasn't Ernest that did that, but Ernest came up with this idea of Homo neanderthalensis, and the earliest European settlers, travelers, said Aboriginal Australians are one step away from being Homo neanderthals. They probably mated with one another. They probably had mixing going on between one of them. Where did they get this idea from? The idea came from Carl Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus is another renowned biologist. He gave us the entire science of taxonomy. Family, class, order, kingdom, species, all of that all came out of Carl Linnaeus. And in 1758, this botanist, this biologist, identified 4 human variances: the American, the European, the Asian, and the African. And they were defined based on the color of their skin. The Americans were red, European white, Asian yellow, African, black, and the blacks had two subdivisions, monster-like and feral. 1758 is the birth of race science. And the white European viewed themselves because of their superior architecture, because of their history with philosophy, because of their ability to think and reason. They deemed themselves superior. Here's a photo. Aboriginal Australians. Now, this was from the 1900s. And these individuals are chained at the neck. Their hands are handcuffed. These individuals were taken off and separated and very often killed. The women, the Aboriginal women, were forced to have sex and reproduce with the white Europeans that were taking over Australia in hopes to dilute and get rid of the Aboriginal blood. And if you were a half caste or a quarter caste, half castes were more closely to the Aboriginal originals than what the quarter caste were. That determined your place within society, whether you were a true slave or whether we paid you for what you did. Charles Darwin in the late 1800s, 1850, 1860, when he landed on Australia, described the Aboriginals as savages, the lowest rungs of human racial hierarchy. Another famous biologist, Thomas Huxley, described the Aborigines within Australia as wonderfully near those of the degraded type of Neanderthals. You blacks, you are closer to a Neanderthal than what you are white Europeans. So therefore, we must control you and regulate you. In 2010, it was discovered that anywhere between 2 and 4% of European DNA is actually Neanderthal DNA. That's what happened in 2010. All of a sudden, the way we viewed Neanderthals changed. Neanderthals weren't these idiots. They weren't stupid. They weren't uncouth. They weren't these cavemen dragging the women by the hairs and clubbing them. Individuals. They were intellects. They had feeling and emotion. They buried their dead, and they mourned the loss. They were skilled with their art and their communication. They had tools. Why the drastic change? Because all of a sudden it was shown that Neanderthal DNA has been passed to the white European. And the white European has to maintain the white superiority. And if they had anything that would dilute their prestige, they had to change that. Haeckel Ernest Haeckel, in 1862, wrote in his journal that he believed Africans were the missing link that connected primates to the white Europeans. Not even on the same level of speciation. We're not even sure that Africans, the colonial view of prosperity, control, and politicism was playing out. During this time, during the 1800s, here, if you're not shaking your head and your blood isn't boiling yet, if this isn't starting to sink in yet, race science, racism, was viewed by colonial Europe as being a liberal, progressive. Think about where we are today. Think about where we are today in society and what is viewed as being liberal versus conservative. But yet in the 1800s, the progressive literal thought, the progressive leftist thought, racism is the progressive path forward if we are to maintain control. Holy crap, what is wrong with us? If that wasn't bad enough, we would travel around the globe, and I say we because we are from colonial Europe. Who we are as the United States is ingrained in who the colonial Europeans were, and those thoughts and mentalities and progressive leftist views of racism came on over. Between 1853 and 1930s, it was popular for white Europeans and white Americans to gather to go and gawk and stare at human zoos. What are human zoos? Human zoos is when the Europeans would travel around from continent to continent, island to island. And when they saw people that didn't look like them, they took them. And they recreated their habitat. They recreated their village in these zoos all throughout Europe and in the United States. And they put these people on display because they were less than. Imagine being a person of color and having to stand in this makeshift hut and be gawked at by white males, females, children, elderly, young, middle-aged, as if you were less than. Sarah Bartman, Sartiji Bartman, South African, was on display within the human zoos very early on, even before the 1850s. She was brought here from South America. She was brought over to Paris, basically, from South America, because she had this enlarged butt, and she had this elongated labia. White Europeans considered her sexually grotesque. And they used her as the model for all Black South Africans. They were all sexually grotesque humans, not worthy of the same status of white Europeans. And so we put them on display. Sarah died in 1815 under the care of yet another infamous biologist, George Cuvier. And after her passing, Cuvier dissected Bartman. Her remains were on display in Paris until 1982, when they were removed and kept in storage. And it wasn't until 2002 when Nelson Mandela pleaded with the Paris government to turn over the remains of Sarah Bartman and return them to South America so they could be buried properly. She died in 1815. She was never buried until 2002. 200 years of being manipulated, oppressed, stared at, made to feel like she was an oddity because of the tone of her skin. Ota Benga was a pygmy. Was brought here to St. Louis in 1904 to be put on display within a human zoo at the World Fair. It was later on display in the Bronx Zoo, forced to live with the chimps. This is Ota in photos from the Bronx Zoo in 1914, living with the apes on display. He shot himself, got a hold of a handgun, a pistol, committed suicide from the stress, the pressure, the humiliation, not even being able to be dignified as a human. And this led into a topic of science that we try to hide, known as eugenics. Francis Galton, who is a cousin of Darwin, Charles Darwin, is credited with creating eugenics, and it was Francis Galton's work that framed Nazi Germany's eugenics plan, Hitler's eugenics plan. Karl Pearson, after Galton passed away, picked up the work of eugenics and continued to promote this cleansing of the people that were not white Eurocentric. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because you've probably had statistics. Karl Pearson is considered the father of statistics. He was a race scientist. He was a racist. He believed in white superiority and that anybody that was of a darker skin tone was not worthy. We look at things such as birth control. Birth control was created to slow the reproductive rate of lower socioeconomic individuals, which disproportionately affected minorities, people of color, Black and brown individuals. Birth control was meant for them to prevent them from reproducing as quickly as whites. Most of your wealthy middle class white Americans back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s were Catholic, Roman Catholic, that did not believe in birth control. That in fact believed that you should have and be able to propagate as many children as you can. The US government lifted up that idea while making sure that people of color did not have the same access to reproduce because they were promoted to have birth control. You don't have the ability to care for those kids. You need birth control. While the white European Roman Catholic was expected to reproduce. The original intent of birth control was to slow the population of people of color so that white Eurocentric individuals could maintain the power. Let that all sink in. And we can dive into this a little bit more during class time, but let that all sink in. And as that is sinking in, and as you reflect back on that and you think about where we are today as a society, if you're cringing, if you're squirming, if you're uncomfortable, if you've got emotions, it's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's also okay to talk about how and what the science is and how it has been misused throughout history.